Welcome to my channel Forever Celeb. Her gaze once held an entire industry captive. Now it can't find a single face in the room. For 60 years, that gaze ruled British theatre, commanded a global spy franchise, and carried the weight of an empire on screen. For more than a decade after her sight began to fail, she kept working anyway, leaning on friends who read her lines aloud, over and over, while audiences never noticed a thing was wrong. What happened the year she walked away from her most iconic role? How did she keep performing once her own eyes betrayed her? And why, at 91 years old, won't she say the word retirement? To understand any of it, you have to go back to York, England, and a girl who had no idea what was coming. Judith Olivia Dench was born on December 9, 1934. She walked onto the stage of the Old Vic in 1957 at 22 years old, and she didn't leave the theater world for the next 6 decades. She wasn't flashy. She wasn't loud. What she had instead was something harder to name and impossible to ignore, a presence that made audiences lean forward in their seats, certain that whatever she was about to say mattered. The Royal Shakespeare Company noticed first. She became one of the defining Shakespearean actresses of her generation, moving through tragedy and comedy with a precision critics struggled to put into words. In 1976, she stood opposite a young actor named Ian McKellen and took on Lady Macbeth. A production so stripped of spectacle that it's still taught in drama schools today as proof that 2 actors and bare staging can carry more weight than any amount of scenery. That partnership, forged in that single production, would outlast careers, marriages, and decades. It would still be standing 50 years later when both of them had far more to grieve than a fictional Scottish king. But theatre, however sacred, doesn't reach the entire world. Cinema would do that. And cinema arrived for Judi Dench not as a young ingenue, but as a woman already in her 60s stepping into a role that would make her instantly recognizable to an entire generation that had never set foot inside a playhouse. In 1995, she became M, the head of MI6 in GoldenEye. Sharp, unsentimental, utterly unimpressed by James Bond's charm. It was a radical reinvention of what a woman of her age was allowed to be on screen, and she held it across 7 films over 17 years, right through Skyfall in 2012. The awards arrived in a steady, almost unbothered procession: an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress in 1998 for Shakespeare in Love, 7 Oscar nominations across her career, more than a dozen BAFTAs, a Tony, and in 1988, she was named a Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire. An honor that by then felt less like an announcement and more like a formality, catching up to what audiences had known for years. What rarely made the headlines was the life running alongside all of it. She married actor Michael Williams, and together they had a daughter, Finty Williams, who built her own career in acting. There was a grandson, Sam, born into a family that had spent 2 generations on stage and screen. And in 2001, while Judi Dench was still one of the most in-demand actresses in the world, still playing M, still drawing crowds to the theater, Michael Williams died of cancer. She didn't stop working. She didn't stop performing. Anyone who has lost a spouse while the world continued to demand their presence in front of cameras knows the particular, unglamorous endurance that requires. In 2012, the same year she said goodbye to M after Skyfall, Judi Dench received a diagnosis she would not speak about publicly for years. She was 77. The condition was age-related macular degeneration. A disease that attacks the macula, the small area at the center of the retina responsible for the sharpest, most detailed part of human vision. The part that lets a person read a sentence, recognize a face, follow the movement of a hand across a stage. Macular degeneration doesn't, in most cases, cause total blindness. What it does is something crueler in its own way. It hollows out the center of sight while leaving the edges intact, so the world doesn't vanish. It blurs, smudges, and slips just out of focus exactly where a person most needs it to be clear. It doesn't announce itself all at once. It arrives in stages, in small losses a person can talk themselves out of noticing, until one day they no longer can. For Judi Dench, that day didn't come quickly. It came slowly across more than a decade, gathering speed in private while she continued in public to do the one thing everyone assumed required perfect sight: act. In November 2022, speaking with Louis Theroux, she finally allowed a small crack of honesty into the conversation. Asked how bad her vision had become, she didn't reach for a dramatic answer. She offered something far more devastating in its plainness. Bad. Bad enough. Bad enough in that you're quite fuzzy. You're just a tad fuzzy. It was the kind of understatement only a woman who had spent 60 years controlling exactly what an audience was allowed to feel could deliver. Minimizing the unbearable because the alternative was to sit inside it. By 2023, the fuzziness had narrowed into something far more absolute. Speaking to the Daily Mirror, she put it in terms that left no room for interpretation. I can't see on a film set anymore, and I can't see to read, so I can't see much. Read that sentence again. A film set wasn't a backdrop for Judi Dench. It was the place she had spent more than half a century learning to command, where the precise angle of a glance, the smallest shift of an eyebrow, could carry an entire scene. To say she could no longer see one was not a complaint about inconvenience. It was an admission that the very terrain of her artistry had become unreadable. And reading, a script, a letter, a line of Shakespeare on a page, had been the foundation beneath every performance she'd ever given. An actress doesn't simply recite words. She absorbs them, turns them over, finds the breath and the silence inside them long before she steps in front of an audience. That process begins on a page. For Judi Dench, the page itself had started to disappear. How do you keep acting when the one sense your entire craft depends on is the one you no longer have? For most actors, the answer would simply be, you don't. Judi Dench was not most actors. She didn't stop. What she did instead was quietly, almost defiantly, rebuild the entire mechanics of her craft around a disability she had told almost no one about. The foundation of that rebuilding was something she had carried since childhood, long before any diagnosis: a photographic memory. After 2012, it became the entire structure holding her work upright. She could no longer read a script the way every actor before her had always done. Scanning a page, marking it up, returning to it in quiet moments to refine a line. So she found another way. Friends began reading her lines aloud to her, over and over, until the words settled into memory the way water settles into stone. I've had to find another way of learning lines, she explained, which is having great friends of mine repeat them to me over and over and over again. It was not glamorous. It was not how the industry imagined one of its most decorated actresses preparing for a role. It was something closer to brute endurance, dressed up afterward as effortless talent. She was honest, in her own dry way, about the limits of the method. I have to learn through repetition, she said, and I just hope that people won't notice too much if all the lines are completely hopeless. It's worth pausing on the quiet courage inside that sentence. A woman 7 decades into one of the most celebrated careers in British acting, still bracing herself for the possibility of failure, still doing the work anyway. On set, she needed to know precisely where a line sat on a page, not to read it, but to anchor herself in space, to know when to turn, when to pause, when a scene partner's silence meant it was her turn to speak. For short scenes, the system held. For longer, more demanding parts, she admitted it grew far harder to sustain. This was the invisible architecture behind every performance Judi Dench gave for nearly a decade, built entirely out of memory, repetition, and the quiet labor of friends who never spoke publicly about what they were really doing for her. Audiences who watched her on screen during those years had no idea they were watching something closer to a feat of memory than a feat of sight. But even the most extraordinary memory has its limits. By 2022, those limits had arrived. Her last major scripted screen appearance came that year in the film Belfast, and since then there has been no major scripted project. The method that had carried her for a decade had finally reached the edge of what it could compensate for. What followed was not a press release. There was no formal announcement, no farewell tour, no statement from a publicist marking the end of an era. Instead, the truth arrived the way most hard truths arrive in a life as private as hers had always insisted on remaining, quietly, almost by accident, in the middle of an ordinary conversation between two old friends. In November 2025, ITV News brought Judi Dench together with Ian McKellen to mark 50 years since their landmark RSC Macbeth. When the reporter suggested filming her up close, she answered without hesitation, "No, you don't, because I can't see anymore." McKellen, 86 himself, joked that they could still see her just fine. She laughed back, "Yes, and I can see your outline, and I know you so well in your Macbeth scarf." Then, almost gently, she said the part that mattered most. "I can't recognize anybody now, and people think, oh, get her. She's got very grand. But it's because I can't see. I can't see the television, and I can't see to read." 2 months earlier, she had revealed something even more private on a podcast. She no longer leaves her own home alone. "Somebody will always be with me," she said. "I have to now because I can't see, and I will walk into something or fall over." True to form, she softened it with the dry humor that has carried her through every interview about this disease. "Fortunately, I don't have to pretend to have no eyesight. I actually don't have it." And then, asked directly whether any of this made her want to retire, Judi Dench gave the answer that defines her more than any award ever could. "I don't want to retire. I'm not doing anything much at the moment because I can't see." She called the condition ghastly. She admitted that being so dependent on other people is terrible. But she did not say the word retirement. She has never said it. Not once. These days, that refusal has found a new direction. Dench and McKellen are campaigning together to revitalize the teaching of Shakespeare in schools across the United Kingdom, returning in spirit to the same partnership that began with Macbeth in 1976. She still appears at public events, always with someone beside her. Still sharp, still funny, still unmistakably herself. She lives now in Surrey, not far from her daughter Finty and her grandson Sam. Her husband Michael Williams has been gone since 2001, and she has spent every year since carrying his absence the way she carries everything else, privately and without complaint. A woman who once held the world's attention through her eyes alone can no longer use them for the one thing they were trained to do. She has not stopped working toward something. She has simply pointed it somewhere new. At 91, with her sight reduced to blurred shapes and familiar outlines, Judi Dench still refuses to call it finished. Whether that's denial or defiance probably depends on whether you've ever watched someone choose to keep going when every reasonable excuse to stop is sitting right in front of them. She built 60 years on a gaze that could fill a theater without saying a word. The gaze has narrowed. The career behind it has not ended.